Welcome to Messy Liberation, the podcast that dives deep into feminism, business, and personal growth. I'm Becky Mollenkamp.
And I'm Taina Brown. Get ready for another messy conversation through the eyes of two intersectional feminist coaches.
Let's get messy. Hello, take two. How are you?
How do they do that? I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right. Actually, you said I've been better the first time we recorded this.
Yeah.
Which was a little mistake thing that we just did, but we're back. And I just was going to say before I freaked out because we were accidentally live on YouTube, that I appreciate when people say I've been better or not great instead of just the automatic, I'm fine.
I'm good. I'm
Because
fine.
that's what we do, right? That's what we
Yeah.
do. We always like to just say, I'm good, I'm fine, when in fact, maybe we're not. And also, I've always wished there was a better question to ask instead of, hey, how are you? Because it's a lot. That's a lot because you're basically asking people to lie because no one wants to lay it on you, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Because it could be a lot. It could be a lot. Yeah. Maybe asking, how are you feeling today? Or I saw something once that was like a really good question. And I can't remember what it is now. Now I feel like I'm going to have to like dig through my inbox.
Yeah, we need to normalize another question. I don't know. Maybe it's like, hey, what's lighting you up right now?
Yeah.
I was asking that, and that'd be weird probably, but only because it's not the norm. We need to create a new norm.
Yeah.
Well, that's not what we're talking about today, but it was something that was just running through my head. So I was like, I do hate that question, honestly, because I feel like we all just lie. And then
it's a nicety that doesn't really help in any way.
Yeah. And then we just teach our children to lie. And to basically, we're teaching ourselves to like minimize our feelings or that our feelings aren't important enough to discuss. Mm-hmm. Anyway, what were we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about how, oh my God, my brain. Well, you asked me a question last week that prompted the beginning of what this episode is going to be about. Yeah. So you asked me last week, would I, in the context of values alignment, right, and making values aligned decisions, would I accept a speaking opportunity at Chief? Can you explain what Chief is for people who may not have heard of it?
Yeah, because we were reading, I had seen, I remember why. This is a couple of brains that are reaching their 40s and into their...
Yeah.
This is how our brains work.
Give us a minute, y'all. We'll get there.
Hopefully we have audience members who relate to the fact that sometimes your brain just is like, wait a minute, I'm not even awake yet. We were talking about Tyra Banks. And as we were talking about Tyra Banks, I got an email from Chief with a story about Tyra that I had...
That's right.
Right. And she was launching an ice cream line, which we didn't talk about last week. It really wasn't relevant to what we were talking about. But it made me think, this is clearly her PR team pitched this to Chief to ask them to write about it because it was like a pretty loose story angle that they were going with. And that sort of prompted me to say, like, would you accept an offer from Chief let's say they reached out to you. You don't have a PR team. If you had a PR team, would you even pitch Chief? But let's say they reached out to you with this great opportunity. They have a large email list. It's all professional women. It's geared really for women who are either aiming for C-suite, are in C-suite, or at like high executive level positions within corporate America. So it's not really you and I, right? It's more entrepreneurial. It's less entrepreneurial and more
corporate.
However, I have met many entrepreneurial women who want to work with corporate clients who are also inside of Chief because of the incredible network of people that are in there. So some of our audience might be inside of Chief. In fact, I know for me anyway, some of my ideal clients are inside of Chief. And it is specifically for women. They are, I don't know if they are apolitical. They may be more, I think they might be apolitical. I'm trying to think if I've ever seen them really take much of a stance.
Yeah.
But they have gotten in trouble in the past because it's run by a couple of white women and it is very expensive. It's something in the like 6 or 5 figures. So bad at that.
Fucking Christ. Wow. I did not know that.
I think it's like a 10,000, 12,000, maybe even more a year membership. And the idea is you're getting access. I mean, I think in theory, there's supposed to be benefits to be inside of it, but from everyone I've talked to, you're basically paying to be in a room with people with some power, which is already a problematic thing anyway.
Yeah.
And then they had some issues a while back around some white women speaking over Black women. And I don't know all the ins and outs of it. And they did a very good job of trying to keep the lid on it. But if you do research, you can find some stories about some of the reasons Chief had some issues about 2 years ago now, maybe a year ago now.
I remember that.
And so they've had some problematic issues, and they maybe are ideal clients inside of that community. And so it prompted this question of, would you accept, let's say, forget about pitching to them, because more than likely we're not going to be pitching to places that we have some values misalignment with. But if they were to approach you with an opportunity to be featured in their newsletter, which goes out to a large audience of people, including their members, but also non-members. I'm not a member and I get the newsletter. They talk a lot about news of importance to women in business, and you're going to get in front of a lot of eyeballs that maybe your ideal client, eyeballs that, are powerful people. Would you accept that opportunity? And it was an interesting question, because I had said, I was approached maybe 2 years ago to flown down to speak at an oil company to women executives inside of an oil company.
Oh, big oil.
They were going to pay for my travel. They were going to pay me a good amount of money to go speak. And listen, I can use money. I'm not rolling in the dough here. I'm not, Tyra Banks level income. And it certainly is appealing on the financial sense, but I had to say no, because it was too much of a values misalignment. The company's values were clearly not aligned with mine. And I had a real strong feeling that the women that were working inside that company more than likely were also not values aligned. I would be going to Texas, already a state where I have a lot of values misalignment. And they're living in a state that's not values aligned with me, working for a company that's not values aligned with me. My feeling is that most of those people would probably not be my people anyway.
Yeah.
And the company was just such a misalignment. So that was a place where it was really easy for me to say no. But what we were talking about is, what do you do when things get a little murkier? Chief is not an oil company. They're not a deeply problematic company.
It's a networking organization.
They've had issues. They're not perfect, but they're not it's not an oil company. So what do you do in these situations? And it's not just that situation. I think these things can come up quite a bit where it's a little murkier. It's a little less clear. It's not like an obvious, oh my gosh, no, I'm not going to go, work for Trump. That's clearly a values misalignment. But let's even say, not to make it too political, but also like Harris. Yeah. It's not a values completely aligned situation for me.
Yeah.
Trump. So those kinds of situations, what do you do? So I want to hear your in the moment thoughts.
Okay, so I have two things I want to point out, or not point out, but just very quickly discuss specifically about Chief before we get into the bigger question, like, how do you make those decisions, right? Because I think with the question that you asked me about, what I see at Chief, or with the example of big oil wanting you to come out, right? Like, those are really big examples, but I think for most of us, those values alignment questions are in little actions day to day, right? And so there's a way to manage that makes managing the bigger decisions easier. So, but before I get into that, so you mentioned that Chief might kind of position itself as being apolitical. And to that, I would tell Chief, there is no such thing as being apolitical.
Correct. You and I know everything is political, and the decision to be apolitical is political.
Exactly. If you have the ability to be quote unquote apolitical, what that indicates to me is an exorbitant amount of privilege that you have to be able to say, well, I don't want to mess into politics too much. And basically what that means is that all the quote unquote things that you view as political don't affect you. So you have the luxury of staying on the sidelines and not really engaging in those conversations, which also indicates to me that you are probably white and you probably have a certain amount of wealth to be able to do that. Financial wealth.
Ding, ding, ding. It's run by white women and the cost is exorbitant. So, yes.
Yeah. And the other thing is the whole cost, right? Like, paying 5 figures to access a network of quote unquote powerful people hello, like that's mimicking our political system, right? So like that in and of itself, like really just kind of gives me the ick because one, it's gatekeeping for people who may not have that kind of financial privilege to be in specific spaces that would allow them access to people with power to collaborate with them, to mentor them, to coach them, to provide marketing services or whatever the case might be. But also like you're basically just taking one of the horrible things about capitalism and embedding it into your networking group that just continues to perpetuate inequality and continues to perpetuate this idea that you can buy your way into the positions that you want to be in. And that does not sit well with me. So last week, when you asked me this question, when I think about making decisions about values alignment, I think of it like as on a spectrum, right? Like, I don't think it's a black and white yes or no, unless it's something like very obvious, right? Like if the Trump campaign reached out and said, hey, can you come in and do a session on DEI? Well, first of all, I know you don't actually mean it. Like you don't care about DEI, right? So that's an immediate no for me. But with things that are a little bit murkier, I like to think of it as being on a spectrum. So last week when you asked me, I was like, well, it's something I might have to think about. But now as I'm talking and I'm like breaking down these 2 points about being apolitical and buying your way into spaces and rooms where powerful people are, which to be fair, I didn't know these things last week. Like I knew that they had taken the stance of being apolitical. I didn't know how much it cost.
Well, I just quickly looked up because I don't want to be besmirching an organization. I was close. And these figures are a year ago. I haven't found what current membership rates are because they're not real obvious with it. Just so you know, like it's not on their website that I have found. You have to go through a whole application process before they'll tell you what it costs. Like
which is also icky.
Exactly. All kinds. They do a lot of the icky shit, but it is actually closer to $8,000 a year, which is still a lot.
That's still a lot.
There's not 5 figures.
Yeah.
And the company is valued at $1 billion.
Yeah. Yeah. So with this new information, it's a hard pass. I think what I told you last week, which I think I would probably still do, is if they reached out and said, hey, can you do this? Or can you come speak to our group or whatever? I would decline. And then I would, what's the word I'm trying to think of? And then I would just like make it publicly known, right? That like, hey, Chief reached out to me and this is why I said no.
Yeah, that's always great content, right? This is why I turned down why I turned down this amazing opportunity.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of things that would get reads. Yeah. I don't know what I would say, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but even beyond it being like great content in the traditional sense of like content structure and content creation, like I think it's also like it's creating clarity to the community that I want to build about where my values, right? So it's continuing to make it clear to them for people who are already in my community or who could potentially be in my community in the future where I stand on certain things. And so I also see it, yeah, sure, it'll make great content, right? Like for SEO, keywords, things like that. But also I also see it as a way to just like continue to build community by making sure that my values are public and transparent as much as possible.
Yeah. The company to me it smacks of sort of white feminism in this like the girl bossy way of showing up in the world, which ultimately is not feminist. It is how do we beat them at their game or at least tie them at their game, meaning how do we as primarily white women beat white men at their game or at least get to where they are in their game? How do we have the same victories they have instead of what I think actually is feminist, which is that game sucks. There is no way we can all win at that game. And so your approach of just trying to get more women, which ultimately usually means more white women, to also succeed at the game isn't feminist because it's leaving behind most women, primarily of color. And I really think the feminist approach is to say, how do we create a new game?
Yeah.
Or system that isn't a game, right?
Yeah.
Because a game inherently has winners and losers. How do we create a new community that allows us all to have success instead of it being like the answer to our liberation is just shifting who's at the top of the pyramid, but the pyramid still exists. And that's the problem. We don't want that hierarchy. How do we get rid of it? That's what feminists, and I think Chief is very much an example of that. Like, and it's not just Chief, and I don't mean to just call them out, although I'm fine with doing that. But there are so many folks that are out there in the online and just regular business space that are calling, like, I think they're trying to use this sort of feminist women's power. You know, we care about women. We care about empowering women, that common refrain. But what they're really doing is not remotely liberatory. It is not revolutionary. It is simply just, we just want to see if we can get more white women to succeed. And I think that's how they're getting to that $1 billion status. And, you know, Taylor Swift, and like, there's so many examples of this same sort of mentality, and that's not winning. And so I get what you're saying. And this is where I was getting to the question where it gets murky. I also know there's a lot of people who feel like one way that I can make a little dent in that is I can sort of be a chaos maker from the inside.
A disruptor.
Right. Like, I show up with my value set, the true feminist value set, and say, if Chief wants to feature me in the way that I'm saying, this is what revolution actually looks like, right? This is what true empowerment for women looks like. And they're willing, and I can be the person who brings that message through them to try and kind of create some of that change inside of that organization to disrupt what's happening there. Then that may feel aligned with my values. And this is where it's murky, right? Because maybe so. What do you feel about that?
No, I actually think that's a legitimate place to be, because what I think that does is that it lets us know that, like, our values are different, right? Like, there are values that you and I have in common, but because of our lived experiences, there are also values that you and I have that are different, right? And so, like, because it is a majority white women space, my values tell me I'm probably not going to be safe in that space. I'm not going to, and even if they were like in the midst of completely restructuring and doing the work, they might very well be at this point. It's like, we don't know, because we're not in those spaces. So being completely generous and giving them the benefit of the doubt, they might be doing that internal work, and it just might be taking a while for that to be seen publicly, right? So in that, if they were to reach out to me, I'd be like, well, it's still majority white. And my experience has been that in majority white women spaces who feel like they can buy their way to power, that is not a safe space for me to be. I know that that's going to trigger me, right? Like, I know that that's going to feel very much like an anxious place. But you, as a white woman, might have a completely different experience, right? And if you see part of, like, your calling or your values as being a disruptor, as being that chaotic agent, because I've seen people do that too, like agree to go on news shows or talk shows or be in articles and completely call out the person that is supposed to be interviewing them or the person who works at the company, right? I've seen that happen. And when it's done right, it can be like a really pivotal moment for the other people in the room. And so if you as a white woman feel like that is part of what you are here to do, to go into those white spaces as an ally and call that stuff out and disrupt, like, the norms, quote unquote, then I say more power to you. Go ahead and do that. Like, let that be part of your work. For me, as a non-white woman, unless I see evidence of change, of movement, of moving away from our feminism is about getting equality with white men, I know for a fact that's not going to be a safe space for me, that I'm going to be triggered.
I'm just doing live research. There, according to Forbes anyway, 33% of chief members identify as women of color. So I just want to share that to say
Yeah.
that is more generous or more than I would have thought.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
ultimately what you're saying, and this is where I think, I totally agree with you, is that it's not even about diversity in like, here's how many people we have that look a different way, but it is about what they represent as an organization. It's held by two white women, and the ethos seems to be pretty clearly of like, how do we get our bag? How do I get this
Yeah.
$0, and how do all of our members get more wealth? And it's not really about changing systems. And for you, that wouldn't feel safe. And I fully get that. This brings up another interesting discussion point that is the kind of thing I think for white women, speaking for myself, and I think from being in rooms with other white women who are trying to do this deep, meaningful work, a thing that comes up a lot is this idea of, I want to amplify the voices of women of color, right? I don't want to center myself in something. And so thinking about like, let's just stop with Chief, okay? Because enough of them. But like, let's say it's a podcast, because this I think is something that's way more common. A podcast approaches me that is like, maybe not the most values aligned podcast. I go and I look and I see like, it's another one of these girl bossy kind of podcasts that have lots of one white woman guest after another. Here they are asking me to be on that. But it's an opportunity. It's a platform. It's a platform to use your voice. I think I could say, well, I'll go on and try to disrupt from inside, right? Bring my ethos and all of that. But the other thing that I often think about is, would it be more useful? Like, I can show up as an ally, as you mentioned, or is it more helpful for me to pass the mic, to pass the baton, to say, I would rather say, Taina and I talk about a lot of the same stuff. She's fucking amazing. You haven't had, you're almost exclusively having white guests on your show. Why not talk to her? Is that amplifying voices and being helpful and is that a better way to be an ally, to like sort of center yourself and to try and lift up a voice that might otherwise be ignored? Or is that potentially harmful? Because what you just asked, what you're saying is like, because what a Chief approached me and I said, you know what? Taina and I talk about the same stuff. She's fucking amazing. She rarely gets she's not getting as much requests as I am, simply because I have this privilege from my skin tone. Would you be willing to feature her? In my mind, hey, that's an amazing opportunity for you to get your voice in front of a lot of people. But then I also hear you saying, but it might not be safe for me.
Yeah.
Consent's important. I would have to ask you first. I'm just talking in a more generic, like, what is the better ally approach in your mind? And again, I'm not asking you of what it means to be a good ally, right? But
no, this is the definitive. Becky.
Okay,
this is the definitive.
Final word for all white people listening.
No, I'm totally kidding. Because, context is important. And I think understanding that context changes from person to person and situation to situation is that is part of breaking down the nuance of how to make values aligned decisions, right? Like, what's the context here? Who's going to be harmed? Who's going to be highlighted, etc. And if going back to your question, if you were to just pass the baton, I think when it comes to allyship, and I was thinking about this after our conversation with Dee also, because when it comes to allyship, let me go back to this thought. When it comes to allyship, I think
quickly, just for the people listening, the conversation with Dee was, I think, 2 episodes ago when we talked about white women and the election. But
yes,
I just make sure people know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Thank you. So when it comes to allyship, I think obviously there are many ways to be a good ally, and it really depends on your circle, right? So in a situation like that, I would not fault you for again, just using the example of Chief. This has not happened, by the way, for those of you listening or watching.
I don't think Chief is ever going to reach out to me after this episode. They're not going to be talking to either of us.
Absolutely not. So this is all hypothetical. We're just using them as an example because they happen to be available to use as an example at this moment in time. But I think, in that case, if you were to pass the baton to me, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? I think that could be an indication of good allyship. I think at that point, then it's my responsibility as an individual to know what are the spaces that I want to be in and that I don't want to be in. And so that responsibility comes off of your shoulders and is now on my shoulders, right? And if it's a space that I deem that I don't want to be in, then I can politely decline, right? Or if it's something that I do want to do, then I can take that baton up. And going back to my thoughts about allyship after our conversation with Dee 2 episodes ago about white women in politics, like I think when it comes to people who are in positions to be an ally, like you as a white woman going into a space that's majority white, you know, being the disruptor, bringing in your values and trying to initiate change that way. I think obviously there's a time and a place for that. But I think as an ally, something that you also have to consider is how that is going to affect how people see you as an ally, right? Because me and you have this podcast together, right? And I can consider us friends. We've never met in person. Like it's all been online.
Going back to our episode about friendship, we decided we were friends. So don't tell me you think we're not. I've been hanging my hat on that we're friends now.
We are definitely friends. We are definitely friends. But, you know, like, as a non-white woman, as a woman of color, as a Black woman, as a queer woman, with a very specific lived experience, the way that I treat allies or people who call themselves allies, or the way that I know whether or not someone is truly an ally is if I know that person is a safe person for me, right? And if most of your behaviors or actions are embedded, are you embedding yourself in like white supremacist cultures, right? Regardless of your intentions, at some point, that is going to signal to me that you are no longer a safe person for me. Because when I'm with you, if we were to be together in person for whatever reason, like if I were to go to your house for a function, or if I were to go to your child's birthday party, most of the people that are going to be there are going to be people from those spaces, right? So like, even though our relationship technically is separate from those spaces, because of how embedded you are into the system, the outer circle, the outer spheres are not safe for me. And that means that sometimes you're a safe person for me, sometimes you're not a safe person for me. And then that makes it hard for me to make decisions about how much I want to be connected to you. And so I've been thinking about that for the past few weeks because, like, again, that episode with Dee, which totally appreciate her perspective. And I think that work is needed. Like, I think white people who consider themselves allies don't come into our spaces, go to your own spaces and disrupt shit over there. I think that's part of your work. Like, you being an ally in like Black or or people of color spaces, like that's not allyship, right? Your allyship is like calling out your own people in your own spaces when they do and say things that are abhorrent, right? But if you continue to choose to embed yourself into spaces with people that you're not normally connected to, then that kind of becomes a problem for me. And I think most people who are people of color or Black people kind of have the same perspective along those lines, because when we meet someone who is white, we're kind of always waiting for the other shoe to drop. We're kind of always waiting. Like, we never feel safe immediately. Like, it's never like, oh, this person's a great person. No, it's always like, how long do I have to wait before I realize that this person is not a safe person anymore? And that doesn't always turn out that way. Sometimes it does turn out that, like, I waited for 6 months. I waited for a year, and this person has not proven me wrong. And so now I feel like this is a really safe person for me. But I would say probably about 60% of the time, it's the opposite.
I'm surprised that low.
Yeah, and for some people it's higher, right? For some people it's higher. For me, it's been about 60. I would say about 60% of the time,
which is still ridiculous, right? It's too many.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
the place where I can relate, not to compare, but to relate, is that as a woman, I have the same feeling around men, right? I definitely don't trust men until they earn my trust.
Yeah.
So I think for white women, that's the place where we can try to find some understanding of that and then apply it to those relationships that we have with folks who have identities that are more oppressed than our identities, right? Is to say, oh, I get that, what that's like with men. Let me remember that as I'm showing up inside of this relationship as the white man version, right? I am holding the privilege in this relationship instead of trying to cling on to the place where it's like, oh, I also like, I think what we often do as white women is try to hold on to the piece when we're inside of a relationship with somebody who is like with a black woman. Often what white women will try to do is to find that commonality of the woman piece, the oppression piece, to sort of get to this place of like, I share your oppression. I get the oppression.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, how can I understand what their experience is like inside of this relationship where I'm now the person who is holding the oppressor identity, right? So for me to think of the places where I am inside of a relationship and the other person has the oppressor identity, how I feel inside of this relationship to say, oh, I'm coming into this relationship with the oppressor identity. How must that feel? I know what it feels like inside of other relationships. So instead of clinging to the piece of like, we both have oppressed identity,
sameness,
right, to look and say, oh, here's how I might be showing up and how that could be making that person feel. And so to then think about when I'm in a relationship with somebody who has the oppressor identity, when I'm inside a relationship with a white man, what are the things they do that can help me, that can signal that I can be safer here, that they will be for a person? How can I bring that inside of this relationship and do the same thing? So I think that's good to think about. The other thing I was thinking is, first of all, you mentioned people who call themselves allies. And I always that makes me, because people who call themselves allies rarely are. It is not a designation that you should be claiming for yourself, just as an FYI. Like when I see somebody who has like ally in their bio or something, I'm always like,
are you though?
Right? How did you earn that designation? Did you are because you really like gay people? Like that's not allyship, friend.
Yeah.
Really, ally is something that other people decide if you are or not. So just for people who are, and this applies to anybody, right? Because we all have, you could be an ally to a community that you're not a part of, right? So you might decide, oh, I'm an ally to the Asian community, even though you're not Asian, right? So you don't get to decide that. The Asian community gets to decide, are you an ally to their community? In the same way, I don't get to determine if I'm an ally to certain communities. They decide if I am.
Yeah.
So I think that's important for us to remember. And then I just want to speak to the whiteness of this, the white women, to say that if we're finding ourselves inside of these communities and trying to convince ourselves that we're doing it to be disruptors, I think we have to really have some hard conversations with ourselves about our motives. I think it's easy for us to convince ourselves, no, the reason I'm showing up here is so I can disrupt things. And I think we have to really have, like, if you want to be that person, you got to be checking in with yourself and your values all the time because power is an addictive drug, right?
Yes.
Privilege is an addictive drug. And it's real easy to start to cling to that power, to cling to that privilege and convince yourself you're doing it for some righteous reason. And before long, lose sight of any of that and just be fully addicted to the drug. And so I think it's really important that we watch for that, because I think I have seen that, and it's not just white women. I see it all the time with all sorts of folks.
Yeah.
Right. To be clear, who start out with these really good intentions for why they are showing up in these spaces and really convince them, and maybe really mean that their intention is to go in and disrupt. But before long, they have swallowed the Kool-Aid. They've drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
And they're participating fully in the system again. They've lost sight completely of disruption.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, I know I wasn't making eye contact. I'm looking for this creator that I came across on Instagram. She's a Black creator, and the majority of the content I've come across of hers is like, are you a safe person for Black people? And so I was trying to find her handle so I can share it with everyone. I'm like looking through, scrolling. I can't find it right now. I will find it though, so we can put it in the show notes. But
not Ashani, is it? Ashani Mifuko?
Maybe.
She's an anti-racist. She's super popular on social media. She's an anti-racism coach, and she does so much incredible content really for white people, I find. So I'll link to her in the show notes. She's very active on Instagram. I'll put her in the chat too, so you can really quickly see if it's who you're talking about. But she's really awesome and does content on TikTok and Instagram and stuff talking about like, it may not be the same person you're talking about, but I'll throw that person
It
out.
is her. It is her. I just looked her up. Yeah. I was going to say,
Really,
is she like really beautiful? Because,
yeah, she's
I
gorgeous.
mean, everybody's
Incredibly
beautiful.
intelligent. And the other person I might
Yeah.
recommend is Blair Amani, who's
Mhm.
also really good at
Yeah.
doing a lot of that kind of content.
Yeah.
Her Smarter in Second series.
Yeah.
And she's with feminist.com. She's awesome too.
Yeah. 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 No, I agree with that thing about allyship, about like, you can't just call yourself an ally and then that's what it is. I think you kind of have to earn that. Like, you earn your allyship stripes by being a safe person for the community that you're trying to be an ally to. And what you were saying earlier about how like white women will sometimes be like, oh, we're the same because we're women, right? They focus on the sameness instead of the difference. And that really brought to mind that quote by Audre Lorde, and I'm going to completely butcher it because I don't remember it by memory, but basically the gist was like, it's not our sameness that connects us, right? Like, let's focus on the differences. Like, our differences is that's where our power is, right? Like, focusing on our differences. And I think we grow up in a world that like, let's find common ground, right? Like, you hear people talk about that all the time, like that being a thing, especially like when it comes to like politics and things like that. It's like, let's see. You do not have to be me. I'm going to read it out loud. Becky, you sent it to me. You do not have to be me in order for us to fight alongside each other. I do not have to be you to recognize that our wars are the same. What we must do is commit ourselves to some future that can include each other and to work toward that future with the particular strengths of our individual identities. And in order for us to do this, we must allow each other our differences at the same time as we recognize our sameness. Yep, that's exactly it. And I think focusing so much on the sameness without acknowledging the differences is where allies lose the picture, right? Like, that's where they lose the plot.
That's the I don't see color people. And that
Exactly.
that's not anti-racism work.
It's not anti-racism work. It's not intersectional, right? Because intersectionality, without an analysis of power differentials, there is no intersectionality. And in order to understand power differentials, you have to understand difference. And you have to understand that difference is not a bad thing. So if you are in a space where people don't look like you, then it is your responsibility as an individual, whether or not you are the ally in that room or the other people are the ally in that room or trying to be. It is your responsibility as an individual to understand what are the power dynamics that are happening here, because that is going to indicate who the allies are and who your people, right? Like, that is going to indicate where there is space for work to be done and where there is not space for work to be done. And I think that's where a lot of like traditional feminists or white feminists or liberal feminists, right, really lose the plot, is that they focus too much on sameness rather than, it's almost like they're afraid of difference because they're afraid of giving up some of that power that they have with their whiteness and their privilege.
I just immediately makes you think of Joanne Rowling. I won't use her gender affirming name, whatever the right term is there. But yeah, Miss Rowling and this turf idea of like focusing on there's only one way to be a woman and looking for that, like finding these pieces that unite us. How are we same? That makes us women, instead of like saying all women are different, right? And let's focus on our differences and also how important that those are. And I do feel like that's ultimately about, I mean, she's a billionaire, right? Although I think she gave away enough wealth that she's not now, but still close enough. And it's holding on to that power. It's what, because as soon as I start to cede some womanness to others and allow them in, right, now they're starting to take away my piece of that pie. And that's that idea of the pie being limited, right? That there's only so many pieces of the pie, and I got to fight like hell to preserve mine, instead of saying, we can just make more pie so that everybody gets some pie. And that ultimately, I think, is like capitalism is the same thing. And all of it, like we use that scarcity as that to maintain the structures.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, talk about a scarcity mindset, right? That idea of like, there's only so much pie to go around, so I don't want to give up my piece for you to have some. That's a fucking scarcity mindset, right? Like, people talk about scarcity mindset in terms of like financial building and financial wealth, but it really gets embedded into everything, right? And one thing that I like to tell my clients is like, you're not a separate person from your person at home. Who you are at home is not separate from the person you are at work, is not separate from the person you are with your friends, is not separate from the person who you are with your family. Like, you are one fucking individual. So whatever mindset you have in any of those spaces, it's going to bleed into every area of your life. So when we're talking about capitalism and how that affects how we work, the kind of careers we go for, the kind of ways that we build wealth, like, that ideology gets embedded into our relationships. It gets embedded into how we see ourselves. It gets embedded into how we raise our children, right? Like, it's not separate. It's not separate. It's all in there affecting everything. I just want to mention, because I went to an info session for this other organization that is like a networking group for women who, it's mostly for women who are entrepreneurs, but it can be for other women as well. Have you heard of Entreprenista?
I was a member for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know a few people who are members of other entrepreneurs who are members. And I went to like an info session of theirs last week. And they have lifetime membership. Like, you pay once and it's 4 figures, but it's low 4 figures. It's definitely not $8,000. It's like maybe a quarter of that. And it's lifetime membership access. And so that, I don't know, beyond that, I don't know much about it, but that in comparison to Chief is already like a win for me, right?
And that's some amazing women inside that community. There's also some women that were much more girl bossy, but ultimately, and I think this, going back to the very beginning of like, how do you values alignment and these murky things, communities has been a piece of that for me too. I think perfectionism is a part of white supremacy. I don't think, I know, like, we know that perfectionism is part of what helps maintain white supremacy. So perfectionism is not something we should be aiming for. There's not going to be a perfect anything, right? The only person who agrees with my values 100% probably is me, because they're mine, right? And so I can't make every decision to say they have to perfectly, completely show up and believe everything I believe, or the only thing and I guess I can, but then I have to know, then that means I'm going to be alone on an island. And sometimes that's what I want, and it's okay. But if I'm looking for opportunities to be on someone else's podcast, to go speak inside of someone else's community, to join a community, all of these things that we're talking about, I have to know that I can't seek perfection in values alignment. What I need to do is think about what are the most important core values, the things that I absolutely need inside of a space, right? And I have done that work to figure that out. And sometimes it means I end up in spaces. Entreprenista is a great example, because it's not Chief. I'm not there because it's so out of alignment. Entreprenista is a place where it's more aligned. It's not perfect. Everyone inside of that community most certainly is not values aligned, but I met amazing people. There are people inside of there. It meets at least some of the higher level requirements, or doesn't go against some of the higher level requirements. And sometimes that has to be enough for me. And then I get inside of spaces like that. And then I start to seek out who are the people that go 4 more layers deep in values alignment. And then I start to pull those, like, I'm pulling those people and pulling them in to find my own community. Because if I am waiting for perfection, it's
never going to happen.
Right. So I think when we talk about these murky decisions, I think it gets to, it's not about, you can only say yes when it's 100%, right?
Yeah.
But it is about understanding yourself well enough to know, what are the absolute no's? What are the absolute yeses? But those are hard, because again, that's those rare unicorns where you're like, oh my God, everything seems to be alignment here. Most of the time, it's that middle ground of like, where am I willing to bend a little? Where am I not? What does it mean if I bend a little? And how will I behave inside of that space or inside of that opportunity? How do I want to show up? And that is the stuff that's more challenging, but that's the work we need to do, because I think for 9 out of 10 decisions we make, 8 out of 10
going to be there.
It's in there.
Yeah.
The easy no's, easy yeses are rarer. It's the like, can I make this work? Is there enough here? It is okay that I won't lose myself inside of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that goes back to thinking of it as a spectrum, as that we talked about like at the beginning of the episode that I mentioned. And so I like to think of it the same way, right? Like, how close is it to a 100% yes? And how far away or how close is it to a 100% no, right? Because again, context is important. That's where the nuances, that's where the messy work of like figuring things out is. And if you can make those decisions thinking of it as a spectrum with like the little things, then when it feels like there's more on the line, it's easier to make those decisions, because what you're doing is you're practicing making those values aligned decisions, right? And so I like to think that there are really 3, maybe 4 absolutely core values that will never change for you in your life, whoever you are listening to this. There are 3 that are just so intrinsic to who you are. And if you can hone in on what those 3 to 4 values are and just have them top of mind, and then filter every decision through that, right? Like I'm talking from like little things to like where you live and how you decorate your house, right? Those things seem inconsequential, right? But it's an opportunity to practice living your values, right? And I think we don't see it that way. We don't see like the minutia of life that way sometimes. But the more you can practice living out your values in the minutia, then when it comes to things that, again, feel like there's a big risk or feel heavy, it's easier to do that. I was gonna say something just now and I totally lost my train of thought. Again, welcome to your 40s.
That's it. I can't even wait to see soon what the 50s bring. Even less memory. Well, I was going to say maybe a great place for us to wrap up then is to share our own core values. Yeah. What are those 2, 3, 4, whatever they are, like the core ones for you? I'll share mine first because you're frozen. Oh, there you are. I'll share mine first though, because I was just thinking about it while you were talking. So to give you a second, maybe you have them right there. But I know for me, liberation/freedom, and I go back and forth between those 2 words because it kind of depends on the situation. But that core feeling of working towards progress and working towards a world where everyone can succeed is really a core value for me. I often call it liberation, but sometimes when it's just something more personally affected, then I would say it's more of my personal freedom. Mm-hmm. So meaning like in my home, does this thing make me feel more or less free, restricted, right? Mm-hmm. Then making bigger business decisions, it's more about liberation in the collective. So that's one of mine. Another one is curiosity. I really want to be in spaces and with people and in, creating environments where we're all curious. We're interested. We want to learn more. We want to know more about each other and about life and about things and like have cool conversations. So curiosity is really important to me. And if I have to pick a third, I waffle a lot on that third one for me because it depends on, they're more situational. Consent is a really important core value for me. But I think maybe my third, if I'm thinking larger about just life in general, is something along the lines of peace, calm. Mm. Does this help to create more peace and calm for me? Mm-hmm. I think those are probably, I would go with like liberation/freedom, curiosity, and then like calm for me. How about you?
Yeah. So liberation is one of my top 3.
That's where we share.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's just, how is this moving the needle towards freedom for everybody? And I think, for both of us as like coaches, right, and service providers, like sometimes we forget that we are part of the collective because we're service providers serving the collective. And so one thing that I've kind of been in the process of for the past couple of months is like, how does this also affect me, right? Like, so like I've been like restructuring some things in my business to make it non-extractive for my community. But then I had this light bulb moment where it was like, but is this extractive towards me, right? Like sometimes we self-extract and like productivity and hustle culture. So that's just an example of like thinking about my core values as not just being for other people, but for being for myself, right? Because I will usually fall into the trap of thinking of it as for other people and not for myself. anyway, all that to say, so like, yeah, liberation, justice is my second one. And I know that sounds a lot like liberation, but it's not. It's not, right? It's connected for sure. Like liberation is, how do we get to a place where we don't need money to survive, right? Justice is, we as a country created this wealth inequality. So how do we get to a place where we can do reparations, right? How do we create wealth equity for people of color, for Black people whose ancestors did not have the same hundreds of years to build up generational, right? So justice, that's the lens of justice. And then my third one is beauty. And that seems really superficial, or that can seem really superficial and shock to some people. But what it means to me is like, how do I find the beauty in this situation? How do I find the beauty in this relationship, right? Sure, I love beautiful things. Like, I will spend way too much money on something that I think is beautiful, and it drives my wife nuts because I like to be surrounded by beauty. But it's also just about the inner work of finding the beauty in the minutia of life, in what some people might deem ugliness, because I truly, 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 truly believe in my core that there is beauty in everything. And I think the world convinces us, the systems convince us that that is not true. And we throw away so much, whether that's people or things or relationships or ideas, right? Or experiences, right? Things like when we experience failure and loss, we consider that a loss, right? And we just want to throw those experiences away. But there's beauty to be felt or to be had in those moments as well. So those are my core values.
I love it. Should I challenge you to say, no, we don't have time, but what's the beauty in Donald Trump? We just won't, because we don't have
I
time.
haven't gotten there yet. That's something that I'm still grappling with.
If you figured out, let me know. Okay, I love that. And I think the fact that our shared core value is liberation is not at all a surprise, since we call the show Messy Liberation. Mm-hmm. And for both of us, I think a lot of the other values, tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like most of my other values, that is the ultimate value for me. And the others are often in service of that value.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Like finding the beauty in everyone, that's what helps us get to liberation. You know, justice helps us get to liberation. Calm and understanding rest and all that gets us to liberation. Mm-hmm. Curiosity, learning to be curious about each other, that gets us to liberation.
Yeah.
I think that's why it's messy liberation. Liberation for both of us, I think, is the ultimate value. And then the other things are kind of like how are in service of that bigger value. Yeah. I love that. And hopefully for other people listening, it's a similar, but I would love to know your core values. So email us, messyliberation@gmail.com, messyliberation@gmail.com. We would love to hear what your core values are and also ideas for what you'd like to hear us talk about.
Yeah.
And then to leave you with this, in 2 weeks from when this airs, 1 week from when this airs. Oh my gosh. 1 week from when this airs.
Yeah.
It will be the day before the election. The day after the election, we're going to do a live episode to talk about whatever's happening in the world at that point. We don't know, but whatever results we do or don't have. And also have Goddess Erica join us to do a little grounding session to help us.
I'm excited about that.
Feel find some calm in what might not be a calming day. So 10:30 a.m. Central, 11:30 a.m. Eastern, 8:30 a.m. Pacific. Hey, Mountain, I see you too. 9:30 a.m. Mountain. Depending on where you are, hopefully you can join us. Go to our YouTube channel. You'll find it, Messy Liberation. You can find our YouTube channel. If you go to the live tab, the event is there, so you can have it remind you when we're going to be there. So come and join us, watch live. We're hoping to see a lot of chat and we can talk with you. And if no one shows, it's okay. It'll still be the three of us.
It'll still be us. Yeah. And you'll still be able to listen.
And if release the episode that day.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you want to do some work on your core values, I just remembered this off the, cause I totally forgot. I'm hosting some free sessions on getting to the root of your values and getting aligned with those. So it's going to be on October 30th, November 6th, and November 8th and November 17th. So
we will link to those in the show notes. Don't forget to send that to me, Taina, and I'll get it linked in the show notes so you can find those there as well. So that's awesome. Thank you for being on this liberation journey with me.
We'll see y'all next time.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Messy Liberation.
Will you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen?
I know people say that all the time, and if you're like me, often you just go on to the next podcast, but truly, taking that moment to do that will really help us reach a wider audience.
Thank you so much for your support and for listening today.
Until next time.